Today we got something a little special for you guys. We are going to be reviewing footage of one of my lovely Patreon supporters' gameplay and giving them feedback, so hopefully you can learn something from this. Enjoy. Alright, we are going to take a look at Grand Hoss's 12 Freehold run that he has submitted, so thank you for that. I really like analyzing gameplay and helping people improve, as well as I do this for myself too. I watch my own footage back to see what I can improve on. And Theorycraft, so I've watched this already. I've watched this through multiple times, and there are a lot of very critical errors that you make, and I want to help fix them. So I want to point them out and kind of talk about what you should be doing versus what you're currently doing, which I think is incorrect. So we're going to dive into the run. We'll watch a little bit of it, and then for the most part, I'll probably skip around and point out specific moments in the dungeon, because a lot of it gets repeated. So a big mistake, for example, that I've seen, but you've also pointed out as well, is that you typically will hit dampen and diffuse together because it's just natural. It's kind of what you do. That's typically bad, but not only were you doing that, but you were sometimes using it when you didn't even need to. So I'll get to that in a bit, but let's just dive in. So I'm going to just go through the first poll, kind of point out what I see, and then after that, I'm going to probably just like slice up what I think is probably kind of important to point out, because there are some polls where it's like just one mob or a couple of mobs, and it's either you do something right in that poll, or you're just kind of making the same like simple mistakes in your rotation that are repeated throughout the run. So I'll cover everything here, but just not to make the video an hour long, we'll do it like this. Okay, so this first poll is an interesting poll, but what you should be doing is you should be rolling in with Dampen Harm active and then using Keg Smash to generate threat, and then applying your Breath of Fire for the additional damage reduction that you're going to get from that aura, and then going into your kind of like Spinning Crane Kick, Blackout Kick rotation. But instead what you end up doing is you end up just spamming basically Spinning Crane Kick the entire time, which makes you energy starved. And then also oftentimes in the key you'll actually use Exploding Keg before using Bonus Brew, which is also bad. So again, still no Keg Smashes being used. You didn't use Bonus Brew, you used Exploding Keg first into Bonus Brew, which is not correct, and I'll explain why in a little bit. At this point, still no Keg Smashes, and now you have every single defensive cooldown rolling, but you still haven't used Weapons of Order, which is like a good way to generate a lot of threat, and it refreshes your Keg Smash, and it gives you a bunch of Mastery, which is a defensive stat. You use Celestial Brew on pull as well. That's not a bad thing, but you could supplement that with a damage reduction cooldown like Dampen Harm, reduce a lot of your damage taken, generate Purified Cheese Stacks, and then hit a Celestial Brew that's actually a little bit more amped than just hitting it raw for only a couple, maybe 80k shield or whatever it might be. So that pull goes down. And your general pathing through here is totally fine. Like, you go up to the edge here and you pull these guys back to, or like you line of sight around the corner, which is fine. But again, all you're doing here is like you're spamming Spinning Crane Kick. So there should have been a Keg Smash there with Breath of Fire. You taunt one mob, you Breath of Fire without Keg Smashing, therefore they don't have the dot on them. And then in a little bit, you're going to just start spamming Spinning Crane Kick. Once again, you want to Bone Dust then Exploding Keg, not the other way around. And then let's just talk about this kind of like last pull, then I'll talk about boss, and then we'll skip around a little bit. So, on this third pull, like, you hit Keg Smash, which is good, and you applied Breath of Fire. You can see that debuff here, which is really good. You want this debuff on every mob all the time forever. But now you're not Spinning Crane Kick to extend that. Your Charred Passions fell off, and, I mean, you ended up reapplying Breath of Fire anyways, but again, spamming Spinning Crane Kick like this only leaves you energy starved. So it's not great to do that, because now you have 2 charges of Keg Smash, and then you're not hitting them at all. You also don't have Breath of Fire being reapplied here. You're going to let it fall off, which again is bad. What's cool about Charred Passions is it extends your current duration on Breath of Fire on the targets that it hits. So like once you Breath of Fire and then you Spinning Crane Kick, it gets extended, which is awesome. But if you're not using Breath of Fire and then you're not extending it on the targets by Spinning Crane Kicking, like that kind of, there's a disconnect in that rotation. All right, and then you guys pull Crag. I don't like pulling him to the Bird's Nest because there's a chance he can reset here. And then this is what I'm talking about. So I'm going to pause. Right here, you decided to use Diffuse and Dampen just so you could stand in that swirl, which you don't want to do. You can walk out of the swirl and just avoid it. Plus, diffuse can be used in phase 2 to actually get more damage. You can actually diffuse the dot back onto the boss if you cast it. So that's just the general vibe of the dungeon. For the most part, you kind of make these same repetitive mistakes. You either spam spinning crane kick too much, do the exploding keg bone dust in the incorrect order. You often pair diffuse with dampen, and you typically let breath of fire fall off, or you don't apply it in the first place. So all of those things are kind of bad. So we're going to talk about, I'm going to kind of go through each of those things in a little bit more detail. I'll show clips, and then I might talk about a little bit like what you should be doing correctly in a run like. So first things first, you're using my Weakaura package, which is great. I love seeing people use this. I love it. Most of it was created by myself. There was some stagger stuff that I ended up snagging from Wago, but I'm really happy to see when people use it because it just makes me feel, good. But there's a couple things about this Weakaura package that whenever I see people do this, it's not just you, it's a lot of people kind of making maybe this error or just not really noticing. But you have these two progress bars here. This lighter green one is Rushing Jade Wind, and this orange one is for your Charred Passions. So if I play this video a little bit more, you're going to see when they get close to expiring, they're going to glow and have this like glow around their border. That means you should be reapplying them before that bar fully expires. So you should be hitting Breath of Fire now, and then as soon as you Breath of Fire, then you should be doing your Rushing Jade Wind. And what that'll do is it'll refresh the bars back to full, and that means you're going to be doing optimal damage. If you don't see both of those bars in this build, you're going to be losing out on a ton of damage, and it just means you're doing your rotation pretty much incorrectly, I guess. So look out for these. That's what they're glowing for. Like, they're not glowing for anything fancy. They're basically glowing when there's less than like 2 or 3 seconds left on the debuff. And you can also see the icon here. This means you only have 1 second left of Charred Passions. The goal for both of these auras for yourself is to have as close to 100% of time as possible. In an ideal key, you're going to see anywhere between like 86 to 92%, and if you can get above that, you played almost like pixel perfect. Next, just something else that I want to point out is that your opener, almost, not every pull, but almost every pull, you never open with a Keg Smash, which is your kind of hardest hitting damage ability, and it applies the kind of Keg Smash debuff to your target, which allows them to be afflicted by Breath of Fire. There's a lot of times where you're just using Breath of Fire on pull before Keg Smashing, and yes, while Keg Smash does reset Breath of Fire cooldown, Breath of Fire doesn't do enough upfront damage, and you're not applying that dot, and that dot that you apply to the targets through Breath of Fire is a damage reduction cooldown. So you want to make sure you always see this little Breath of Fire icon over all of your nameplates. Dampen Harm is a really cool ability, like I said before, and you've already pointed this out, but you often pair the two together, Diffuse Magic and Dampen Harm, and you pair them together at weird times. Like in this Harlan fight, you paired it with Diffuse just so you can stand in a charge, and that's kind of, I would like say, not the greatest play. There was a point later in the dungeon too where you did like a normal pull, and then there was one mob left, and when there was one mob left, you also hit Diffuse and Dampen, which is just very strange. You should only really ever pair Diffuse with Dampen Harm in like very dire circumstances where you're not only taking a ton of physical damage, but you're also having an onslaught of magical damage, and maybe you have some dots on you as well. In those circumstances, Diffuse and Dampen is maybe fine to use and you can make an argument for it, but generally speaking, Diffuse magic should be used to either reflect dots or to mitigate some more heavier magical hits to the tank. And Dampen should be used in a more general sense whenever you're taking like just auto attack damage or if there's any kind of heavy tank buster, because again, Dampen is very effective against those. Skipping ahead a little bit, Council of Captains, tanks are extremely sturdy here, but that really shouldn't be the reason to take more damage than you necessarily have to. Throughout the entire encounter, you just stood in the Grape Shot frontal from Eudora. You can avoid this. The rotation of her ability always goes from left to right, depending on which, like, on the corner she jumps to. So always roll to her right-hand side, and then simply just move behind her so you don't get applied by the Grape Shot debuff. On your first wipe, you went to, like, 5 stacks, and then on subsequent attempts, you still went to, like, 1 or 2, because you walked through the frontal instead of just around it. Another thing here is you want to make sure you're reapplying your Rushing Jade Wind before even pulling mobs. What's really cool about this ability is it doesn't require any resource. It doesn't require mobs to hit. You just put it up before going into a pull. Later in the dungeon, there's a handful of different pulls where you roll in. You either Keg Smash or Breath of Fire, sometimes in the right order, sometimes in the wrong order. And then you'll apply Rushing Jade Wind after the fact. You can save that global and do it early, and that's going to provide you with a much more explosive opener and better sustained damage and threat upon pulling. Also, there's a few times where you I'm not sure if it's like a fat finger or not, but you tend to use Spear Hand Strike just randomly and often, almost as if it's in your rotation as a damaging ability. Your Spear Hand Strike is obviously just a kick, so make sure you're saving it to kick casts. And then I want to just highlight this again. Your general rule of thumb, you should be using Rushing Jade Wind before pulling mobs, and then you want to make sure you're Keg Smashing, and this is going to take priority almost over pretty much anything. And then right after that, you want to use Breath of Fire. That should be your general rotation, and that should be your spell priority. Keg Smash is priority, then Breath of Fire. After watching half of the dungeon at this point, it seems like you know what the rotation should be. You know that you should be Keg Smashing, you should know that you should be applying Breath of Fire, because you do that in some situations and typically in single target. But then other times it seems like you're just pure panic mode, and I think you default to just button smashing. And that button smashing typically will result in spinning crane kick spamming, because it feels like a good ability to hit to do a lot of damage. It hits everything around you. It hits multiple times, but the problem with that is it interrupts your rotation hard, because it's a high energy cost spell, especially when spammed. So you want to make sure you have enough energy to Keg Smash first. You should only ever cast Spinning Crane Kick once before weaving in another ability. So it should be Spinning Crane Kick, Blackout Kick, Spinning Crane Kick, Breath of Fire, Spinning Crane Kick, Keg Smash, Spinning Crane Kick, Rising Sun Kick. That's just an example, but you should never be Spinning Crane Kick, Spinning Crane Kick, Spinning Crane Kick. And there's a few reasons for that. First, like I mentioned, high energy cost. Second, if you spam Spinning Crane Kick, you'll actually kind of reset the channel, and it still costs the same amount of energy to use, but you're gimping your damage because it's not allowing the ability to fully channel. There is a macro for this. I'd have to find it, but if you have a habit of spamming Spinning Crane Kick, you might want to pick up this macro. It basically doesn't allow you to Spinning Crane Kick if you already have a Spinning Crane Kick active. At this point, I want to just make note of your positioning. There have been several pulls up to this point. Mobs are just behind you, so they're meleeing you in the back. As a tank, you want to make sure you're grouping up mobs, and in doing so, you want to make sure that they're all in front of you. First, you can't dodge attacks from behind, but also, you can't hit mobs when they're behind you, outside of things like Spinning Crane Kick. So when you are casting frontal-based abilities like Breath of Fire, you're gonna miss a lot of those mobs. In terms of really bad positioning, the biggest example I can see from this is your pull after the second bridge when you're heading up to face off upon Harlan. But there's been several pulls where there's mobs behind you just meleeing you in the back, and that's why you're taking a ton of damage. You saw this on the first pull. You saw this right after Council of Captains, and of course at the back half of the bridge. So really make sure that you are facing all of the mobs. Now, that might come down to nameplates. Sometimes the way your nameplates jump around make it seem like that. So I'm not sure if it's a nameplate issue or not, but really focus on making sure all the mobs are in front of you. The pull right before you get to the Ring of Booty, you had Weapons of Order available and ready, but then you decided to not use it. This cooldown is extremely powerful for damage, but it also, like I mentioned before, offers you Mastery, which is a defensive source. It's going to give you just more dodge through your Mastery, which is Elusive Brawler. So just make sure you're using this on cooldown, especially when it's up at the start of a pull. You guys ended up actually dying here, and again, while Spinning Crane Kick can do a good bit of damage, it's more of a filler spell, and spamming it's only going to leave you vulnerable. The last couple notes here, there's a lot of times where you pull with Taunt. This isn't necessarily the best thing in the world. You want to pull with hard-hitting abilities like Keg Smash. Then follow that with a Breath of Fire, and then one single Spinning Crane Kick. Then if you need to taunt a specific mob, or then taunt maybe in a mob that's kind of far away, you can do that. But pulling with Taunt and then going into something like Breath of Fire, it's kind of defeats the point of even taunting in the first place. The last pull of the dungeon can be really spooky. You want to make sure you have cooldowns going into this pull if possible. even if that means skipping around the previous pull and then coming back to it later, either after you defeat these mobs in the boss room or Harlan himself. You ended up wiping to a wombo combo of Thundering Squall, Painful Motivation, and Shattering Bellow. The counter to this is make sure you're kicking Thundering Squall and making sure you're stopping Painful Motivation if your group needs to. Painful Motivation is kind of a niche ability though, because it makes the mobs take a percentage of their health in damage every second. So if the tank can live, or if your group can live, it's worth letting it go off. But in this case, probably interrupting it would have been the play. So one quick thing that I wanted to do, I don't know when I'm going to put this in the video. So I just finished recording kind of all my thoughts on the dungeon run and the key, but I'm going to put this in wherever I feel like it fits best. But I want to talk about the build you're running, because I think it'll kind of give some insight into what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong, or where you're struggling a little bit in terms of like damage or rotation, because gear is pretty important for the Brewmaster monk. Trinkets are important, making sure you're in the right talent build, having obviously like a 4-piece set or a 3-piece or a 2-piece set, pretty important. So over on Raider.io, we can see this Freehold was actually run 16 hours ago. And we can see your guys' build here. So we're going to actually be able to open this up in Calculator, or we can actually just see your gear and build. So if I go through this, we're going to see that you were wearing a handful of like really heavy haste pieces. So here, gloves, you have haste, bracers, haste, belt, haste. Your ring has haste, your weapon has haste. And yeah, you just have a ton of haste on your gear. Your chest has heavy haste. Now, of course, this comes down to kind of RNG. There's some players who are able to spam keys or get lucky and get the gear that they want. In this case, you might have gotten pretty unlucky with some of the gear. Once you have your 4-set bonus, that'll help a lot. That'll help identify your stats a little bit better. Getting a better weapon might be helpful. I'll leave these in the notes for you, like what gear I would recommend maybe farming or replacing. But it comes down to the fact that you just have way, way, way too much haste on your gear. Now, quickly, in terms of talents, I want to cover that. So we'll open this up in Calculator, and let's talk about talents. So let's quickly talk about your class tree. The only thing that I would really change about this is possibly dropping Strength of Spirits for maybe like an additional roll charge or close to heart. You are running Hasty Provo, which is fine, though there aren't a lot of times in Freehold where Hasty Provo is like gonna be important. There are certain dungeons where it is good. Big dungeons that I like to run Hasty Provo in would be things like Neltharis for Magma Tusk, or using it in Neltharian's Lair for Dargirl, the last boss, because his damage is based off of the time he spends moving, not distance. So Hasty Provo there can actually get him from point A to point B with less damage taken. So there's things like that. Now, when it comes to your actual spec talent tree, there are a few things I would change. First, throughout a lot of the run, you ended up not efficiently using Charred Passions in the way it should be played. The reason why Charred Passions does a lot of damage in the current meta is with the new 4-set bonus. Since you don't have the new 4-set at all, it's not really worth running, though it will probably do more damage than Dragonfire Brew in lower keys. Dragonfire Brew is great for 2 reasons. First, it's one less button you really have to think about. You basically don't need to worry about this aura buff through Charred Passions and making sure that you're spinning crane kicking, like using spinning crane kick often. Dragonfire Brew is also great because you can sit in higher stagger and get like good damage out of it. In terms of this, I would play Dragonfire Brew, especially if you're playing things like Bone Dust Brew. Also, you probably want to be running Bountiful Brew instead, because this has a low chance to just proc Bone Dust Brew anyways, which will help get you more damage. So I would change this to Bountiful Brew. I might play Dragonfire Brew in this case, especially with your gear setup. And then you're running Facepalm. This is maybe until when the buffs come out in like this next weekly reset, this might be worth. But instead, I would pick up Pretense of Instability, especially in a dungeon like Freehold. Every time you activate Purifying Brew or Celestia Brew, it's going to just give you a flat 15% dodge for 5 seconds. This is really, really nice with the new tier set, but even in a dungeon like Freehold, the majority of the damage you're going to be taking is just like raw auto attacks, which you can obviously dodge. So having a higher level of dodge throughout almost the entire key is going to net you way more benefit than running Facepalm by itself. So those are the major changes I would make to your tree. You can argue that you could probably run Blackox Brew, or you can maybe change this to training depending on your comfort level, but this is the tree I would run instead of what you did in this 12 Freehold. I hope that makes sense. And again, in terms of gear, I'm going to kind of make note of that in the document I'm going to send you, but just look out for that. Okay, and I think that does it. Anyways, thanks so much, TheSicknessXTV, or Grande Hoss, whichever you'd like to be called. Thank you so much for submitting this to me. It was really fun to kind of dig through. I hope this has provided useful, and of course, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll maybe help clarify some stuff. So again, thank you guys for your support. I hope you all enjoyed, and I will catch you all in the next one. Peace.